So in 1399, when Richard's rule has gone so badly wrong that it is clear that England and his people cannot be protected in the way that the understanding of England's constitution and the role of the crown means that the role of the crown should be protecting them. Something's got to be done. And Henry has to believe that it's the will of God that he should take Richard's place. Anyone who gets disgruntled for whatever reason, and the Percys, the great family of the North, are a great example of this. They have supported Henry in 1399. They've been his right-hand men. They've had huge power handed over to them. But by 1403, Hotspur is extremely angry about how he's been treated. He's had power given to him and then taken away. He's been made to pay for the war in Wales more or less himself because Henry's also got no money. And he decides that he's made a king once, he'll do it again.
Hello. At the end of June in 1399, Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt and cousin to King Richard II, landed at Ravenspurn in Yorkshire with a small force intent on the overthrow of Richard. The king, who was in Ireland, did not rush to return to England, but when he did, his throne was lost, and Bolingbroke became King Henry IV. Richard would die in mysterious circumstances not long after. Henry had secured the throne, but his would not be a happy reign. Joining to discuss the two grandsons of Edward III is Helen Castor, author of The Eagle and the Heart, the tragedy of Richard II and Henry IV, as we delve into the two characters in a fascinating period of medieval history. Coming up on the podcast, naval historian N.A.M. Roger joins to discuss the maritime history of Britain in a two-part special. We have the Mafia and the Kennedys, and ancient Greek history with the Sicilian expedition. But until then, if you can give a generous review on Apple or Spotify, I'd be most grateful. And now it's over to me and Helen Castor on Richard II and Henry IV. Helen, welcome to Aspects of History. Thank you very much for joining me. It's a great pleasure to have you on to talk about The Eagle and the Heart, the tragedy of Richard II and Henry IV.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Well, I've been really enjoying reading this, and actually beautifully put together by Alan Lane. I'm a massive fan of their binding and covers and everything. They're amazing, aren't they?
It's a lovely object, and I'm so thrilled with the jacket. And of course, one of the great things about writing about Richard II is he was so good at commissioning art. So the illustrations are a joy to me as well.
Yes. Well, because I was interested when I first. When I hadn't even read anything about it, I thought that the Eagle and the Heart, I got them the wrong way round. I thought the Henry would be this sort of regal, the heart. So
it's fascinating, isn't it, that the heart was Richard's self-chosen badge, that at a point in his reign when he was consciously developing his own brand, it was the white hart that he chose, this very luminous, elegant, gorgeous white stag. And Henry used lots of different badges during his life, but it's at the crucial point of crisis in Richard's reign, and therefore in the book, that he gets referred to as the eagle actually by poets and writers. It's a badge that his father had used and his grandfather, their grandfather, Edward III, had used. But yes, he gets called the Eagle Duke. So it's not necessarily one that he chose for himself in the same deliberate way, but it plays a crucial role in the story.
Yes. It's so interesting that these two, and I guess we have to get Shakespeare out of the way. Let's just deal with it now. Now, I was thinking about this because presumably as a very distinguished historian, you don't really get worried about any of this sort of guff that is produced by, albeit the greatest dramatist of all. But because you can see through that, you have access to the primary sources and you can bring your analytical mind to it. Whereas it's people like me who have read Shakespeare who will sort of find it difficult to get our vision of Richard and Henry out of our minds. Is that right?
Well, I hope I can reassure you, because the first thing I need to say is that from my point of view, it's not guff. It is some of the most exquisite writing by one of the greatest writers there's ever been. So in that sense, it's extremely intimidating. How very dare I try to tread in these footsteps? But actually, I think one of the extraordinary things about the play Richard II, which I would want to make a case for being not only the greatest of Shakespeare's history plays, but I would want to argue perhaps the greatest play he ever wrote, is how well he knows his history. That there are so many places in that play where you can recognize where he's taking inspiration from. And so, although he is taking liberties, of course, he's compressing time, he's conflating characters, he's changing people's ages if it suits his dramatic purposes better. Actually, at the heart of the play, the problem with Richard's rule, the dilemma Henry faces in attempting to challenge him, and then the the tragedy of Richard's unraveling once the crown's been taken from him, all of that really hits various human and historical nails on the head. I think, in a way, the Henry IV plays are a little bit different because poor old Henry, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, that Richard is such a charismatic character for all the wrong reasons, possibly because he's very bad at being king. But Henry Bolingbroke in Richard II and Henry IV in the plays that have his name on them, is much more of a shadowy figure. Bolingbroke serves as Richard's nemesis. And then when we move to the Henry IV plays, he's a grey man in the background behind Prince Hal and Falstaff and their rambunctious goings on. And in the Henry IV plays, seems an awful lot older than, I mean, there's a scene very early on where he's talking to the Earl of Northumberland about their sons, Hal and Hotspur, and it sounds as though that's how the generations work. But in fact, Hotspur was 3 years older than Henry IV. So Shakespeare's messed around with things for reasons that are completely comprehensible. But one of the things I wanted to do was to bring Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV, out of the shadows and set him alongside his cousin Richard and see exactly how their relationship and the deposition of one man by the other actually played out.
Their first cousins, they got their father, the relationship with their fathers. I suppose Richard didn't have much of a relationship with his father because his father died when he was very young.
That's right. And yes, the Black Prince, Richard's father, the eldest son of Edward III, the heir to the throne, the man everyone thought was going to become king as King Edward IV, died in the summer of 1376 when Richard was just 9. And for years before that, most of the years of Richard's life, he had been chronically unwell. So the great hero of Crécy and Poitiers, the hero of that early phase of what we call the Hundred Years' War, was not a figure that Richard knew personally. Richard knew all the stories, but he'd never seen his father in his pomp, in his prime, nor had he ever seen his grandfather, Edward III, in his pomp and his prime, because Edward III, too, was an aging and unwell man. So Richard knew he was going to become king. The crown was skipping a generation once his father had died, but he'd never actually seen kingship in action. Meanwhile, you have Henry, his first cousin, who's 3 months younger than him, so they're almost exactly the same age. And Henry's father was John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the next oldest surviving son of Edward III, a proud and ambitious but devotedly loyal man who was doing his best to fill the gap left by his father and his revered older brother in holding government up, holding the kingdom together until his nephew Richard III should be not Richard III, sorry, it's a completely different Shakespeare play. His nephew Richard II should be old enough to take over the reins of government for himself.
But so, do you think that therefore means because Richard, he sees an idea of kingship from people who are telling him what it's like to be a king, but he doesn't really have anyone to an actual monarch, his father or his grandfather, to act as the kind of guiding hand. So it's
I
more of an
think
idea.
that's crucial because if you look at the upbringing of the Black Prince, his father, Edward III, had been only 17 when the Black Prince was born. And Edward went on to have 11 other children with his wife, Philippa of Hainault. So the Black Prince had been thrown in the deep end as soon as he was old enough to have a go at anything, including fighting. He was only 16 when he won his spurs at Cressy. So that sense of what the job was very real to the Black Prince. Yes, it was about being royal and magnificent and revered and obeyed, but in order to, the other side of that coin was that you did the job, you ruled, you fought, you took account of the needs and interests of your kingdom. The Black Prince was very keen on ceremonial and magnificence, and in a sense, I think what Richard ends up seeing as he's growing up is that formal structure of ceremony and pomp in a household in which his father's an invalid and he himself is wrapped in cotton wool because he's his father's only surviving legitimate child. The whole future of the bloodline of this eldest son of Edward III rests on his shoulders. And the sense I got of his education, we don't have many details. You have to kind of join dots in terms of what the outcome was. But I don't think anyone was pushing him to think, to learn, to fight. We know he liked hunting, but the military side of things, the governmental side of things, he's really not being encouraged or forced to step up to what the content of the job is. He's just being told he's very, very special. And there's a wonderful moment. I mean, horrifying in retrospect when you see the kind of effect it had. But in January 1377, just days really after Richard's 10th birthday, his father had died 6 months earlier. His grandfather is ill and not expected to live much longer, doesn't live much longer. And the men who are running government bring him into Parliament to reassure the community of the realm that the future is still bright because they have this young boy who is going to be the next heir. And the Chancellor, who happens at that point to be a bishop, makes a lengthy speech, which is recorded in detail in the Rolls of Parliament, saying the king has sent the Prince, Richard, to his people just as in the scripture it says, I have sent my son. I have sent he who is wished for by all men, and you must do reverence to him, just as the pagans, that is to say, the Magi, did to Christ. So everyone sitting there knows this is rhetoric. Everyone's, they're trying to hold the country together. They're trying to say, okay, look, don't worry. Just as God looked after his people, so the king is looking after you. The one person who doesn't know it's rhetoric is the 10-year-old boy who's just heard himself described literally as the Messiah. And you see that kind of understanding that it's all about who Richard is and the proper reverence that should be done to him that is at the heart of what he thinks being a king is all about.
Okay, so for the coronation, and I guess this only really hit home for me since seeing a coronation quite recently. The boards going up and the anointing of the new sovereign with a 10-year-old Henry right next, witnessing this.
That's right. I had exactly the same feeling, even though I had by this stage, I'd read these accounts of medieval coronations and I'd written in the first chapter of the book, I'd written my account of Richard's coronation. I knew all this stuff, and still I felt as you did, that actually seeing King Charles III being anointed and crowned on the same spot that Richard had been crowned on in 1377, there's something about the continuity of that very sacred ceremony, however much we, the tide of faith may have retreated in the modern world. And then to imagine a 10-year-old boy at its center, so small that when he was carried out of the coronation at the end of the ceremony by his tutor, this little boy wrapped in the coronation robes with all the regalia, one of Edward the Confessor's slippers, part of the ancient coronation regalia, which of course was adult sized, actually slipped from Richard's foot and got lost in the crush, which we know because adult Richard later on gave a new, very splendid pair of slippers to the Abbey to replace the one that had got lost. It is an extraordinary thing to think about the psychological effect that that ritual and the acclamation of all of his nobles, all of his people, anointing by God would have had on a 10-year-old boy who's been told for as long as he can remember that he's unique, irreplaceable, the chosen one.
And also, I suppose, from Henry's perspective, this is something that, I mean, it's not as if, he's going to be skeptical either. He's 10 years old. He'll believe all this as well, which is why it makes, I guess, if we skip forward to the 1399, he is overthrowing someone anointed by God.
It is a terrifying prospect for him and for the country. As you say, he had, at the coronation feast, he'd taken over from his father, who had other jobs to do at the feast, of holding the sword of justice, the ceremonial sword of justice, standing, the Penny Mordaunt role, if you like, standing next to the newly crowned king, his cousin. All his life, he, as you say, he's not been plotting in corners saying, I want to be king instead of Richard. That's not how anyone thinks. This is a sacred bloodline that reaches all the way back to the William the Conqueror. So in 1399, when Richard's rule has gone so badly wrong that it is clear that England and his people cannot be protected in the way that the understanding of England's constitution and the role of the crown means that they should be, the role of the crown should be protecting them. Something's got to be done. And Henry has to believe that it's the will of God that he should take Richard's place. And in fact, on the 13th of October, 1399, the feast day of Edward the Confessor, who is the patron saint of Westminster Abbey and has become the patron saint of Richard himself, Henry is crowned in the exact same spot, in the exact same way as he had witnessed 22 years earlier. It is a terrible responsibility that he is taking on then, and he has to believe that God wills it and that God will subsequently vindicate his rule. It's not quite as clear cut as that, but that's as it plays out, that becomes a conclusion that's very hard for him to hold on to, given the challenges he faces and the fact that as his reign unfolds, it is the opposite of plain sailing. But that is the conclusion that he has to hang on to, because otherwise the enormity of what he's done is too terrible to contemplate.
But if we're drilling into that decision he makes, I mean, he has his lands taken from him. Isn't that the main motivating factor? A loss of status and wealth
In
that
one
overrode his piety.
In one sense, you're right. If one looks at it on a very instrumental level in that moment, yes, he's already been exiled by Richard. Richard's reign has become a terrible conflict-ridden thing, and Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, the Earl of Nottingham, have accused each other of treachery. Richard has said, you must fight a duel to prove the truth of this. Richard then stops the duel, sends them both into exile, but says you can inherit anything that comes to you while you're in exile. Then John of Gaunt dies, and Richard says, no, actually, I'm going to keep the Duchy of Lancaster, the greatest noble estate in the entire country. Despite my promises and despite the laws of inheritance, I'm going to keep it in my own hands. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. That is the inciting incident, as a film writer, screenwriter might say, that brings Henry to the decision that he must challenge Richard, he must come back from exile, he must raise his banners in England, and he must come to claim, it transpires, not only the Duchy of Lancaster, but the crown of England for himself. But if we take a step back from that moment, the point is that what Richard does in seizing the Duchy of Lancaster, seizing Henry's inheritance out of his hands, if you like, that is the final straw of what has been, by this stage, 2 years and more of out and out tyranny, in which Richard has shown that he doesn't believe that the law he imposes on all of his subjects should have any power to bind him. He doesn't believe that his royal will, whatever he chooses to command at any given moment, should be restrained by anything. In other words, that all his subjects, instead of being protected, defended, and supported by royal authority as expressed through the rule of law, that protection for property rights, for bodily safety, that sense that there's a set of rules that we're all playing by, and the king is the keystone that will lock that all into place. Instead of all of that, every one of England's subjects are discovering that they are vulnerable. Richard's been doing all sorts of things, including recruiting what is essentially a private army. Now, why does a king need a private army within his own kingdom when in theory he can call on the service of every one of his subjects if he needs to fight England's enemies? Richard's now got not only a private bodyguard, but the basis of a private army if he wants one. He's been saying things like, I'm going to grant a general pardon to all my subjects, apart from 50 people, and I won't tell you who they are. So that leaves all his subjects saying, okay, do I need to apply for an individual pardon? What if I'm one of those 50 people? But if I apply for an individual pardon, am I admitting to being guilty of something? You know, it's a profound condition of insecurity that Richard is creating. And so when Richard shows that he can just simply seize the greatest noble inheritance in the country by far, despite the fact that Henry's been convicted of no crime, there's no legal judgment against him. Richard is simply destroying Henry and his bloodline. Henry has sons, but their inheritance is being taken away. If the Duke of Lancaster is not safe, then no one's safe. And you see the implications of that when Henry does come back. He comes back with a small handful of loyal servants who've been with him in exile in Paris. He doesn't come with an army, but England rallies to his banner. Richard has taken himself off to Ireland, again, showing his misunderstanding of what he's just done. He thinks he's safe because he's destroyed Henry, takes his private army off to Ireland. By the time he manages to scramble enough ships and to come back, England's already lost because England has rallied to Henry with not a blow being struck. So you're absolutely right. In one sense, it's a very personal complaint, but it's a personal complaint that stands as a part for the whole. And so it's a huge breach of, we don't often generally talk about the English constitution, but it is, you know, the constitution in the sense of the structure that governs the structure and the set of assumptions that govern the relationship between the king and his people.
Taking all that in mind, a monarch that's often mentioned in the same breath as Richard is Edward II. And okay, I understand that Richard would be, you know, have this kind of messiah complex, but he must have been because this is a normal for his class and is to be educated in some principles of reigning, and he would have known that Edward II, the result of, you know, what Edward II's, well, I guess it wasn't quite a usurpation, but he was overthrown.
You'd think, wouldn't you? That's such a
Yeah.
good point and such a good question. Yeah, Edward II had been overthrown in 1326, 1327, deposed and replaced by his son, who becomes Edward III. You absolutely would think that that would be a key example, a key lesson of what not to do. But the extraordinary thing, and Richard was very, very aware of the events of 1326, 1327. Edward was his great grandfather.
Oh, he was then. This was
Yeah.
something, right?
Yeah, yes, he was very, very aware of it. But the first time that we're aware that it comes up explicitly in politics is during a crisis in 1386, when Richard is 19. In any normal circumstances, you would expect a 19-year-old king to really be getting their hands on the reins of power. But what's been happening during the 1380s is a terrible sort of struggle between Richard and his great nobles, led principally up to this point by John of Gaunt, because the war is going on, the war with France is going on. It's going very badly, and we have to take that really seriously, because it doesn't just mean, oh, some bad news is coming over from France. The south coast of England is being raided quite regularly. There's a real threat, and the threat that happens in 1386 is what I've ended up calling in the book the threat of a French armada. The French are gathering the greatest fleet that's been seen since the conquest at a Flemish port, and they are intending to invade. This is a full-scale threat. John of Gaunt has just gone abroad to fight abroad. So the parliament that meets in 1386 is led by Richard's youngest uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, who is a bit of a sort of chippy character anyway. He feels he's not had his moment in the sun politically, so this is going to be his moment in the sun. But the problem is that Richard has not been looking at the war and the risk and the threats and so on and thinking, oh God, we better do something about this. As far as Richard's concerned, the war is nothing outside Richard himself and his own little environment is really very real, it seems. Richard doesn't want to fight. He's never wanted to fight. And he really resents the fact that his nobles have been trying to make him go and fight for a long time. They have, in fact, made him go to Scotland in 1385, and he thinks that's just an outrageous thing to have made him do, and he comes back as soon as he possibly can. So instead of seeing that the threat comes from France, he thinks the threat is that his great nobles are not allowing him to rule in the way he ought to because he's the king. So when Thomas of Woodstock comes to him in 1386 during the Parliament and says, you have got to do something about this. The French are about to invade. You're not taking it seriously. You're not engaging with Parliament. You're not offering leadership. Richard says, this is outrageous insolence. I wouldn't dismiss a scullion from my kitchen at your request, let alone my household men, etc., etc. And if you keep doing this, I'm going to ask my cousin, the King of France, for help against you. Now, bear in mind, there's a fleet massing about to cross the North Sea, and he's choosing this moment to say, my cousin, the French king, another king, will understand that I am being menaced by my insolent subjects. And so Thomas of Woodstock, his uncle, brings the example of Edward II out of his back pocket and says, just remember what's happened in the past. Now, Richard knows enough to know that there is a serious threat there. And so, yes, he realizes he's going to have to not ask the King of France for help, and he's actually going to have to accept some of what goes on in this parliament, although what he then does, it unfolds into a much bigger crisis 2 years later. But the lesson that Richard learns in the long term is not, aha, I better look at what Edward II did wrong. Richard spends the next 10 years trying to get Edward II made a saint. He sends repeated embassies to Rome to try to get the Pope say that Edward II is a saint and a martyr. In other words, Richard is confirmed in his opinion that Edward II was the victim of outrageous, unjustified and unjustifiable rebellion by subjects who didn't understand their divinely ordained duty of obedience to their sovereign. It seems extraordinary, and it particularly seems extraordinary once we know that Richard faced the same fate in the end. I mean, they modelled, because a deposition is a terrifying thing, they modelled Henry and his advisors modelled what they did in 1399 as much as they could on the example of 1327, because it was the one precedent that English history gave them. But right up until that moment, Richard seems to have seen his reign as an opportunity to right the wrong of what had happened to Edward II. And one of the things, sorry, I realise I'm
I'm riveted. I'm riveted by it.
But I think one of the lessons that Richard learns, that's the wrong lesson, you and I would say, is that where Edward II had gone wrong was in having a son by whom he could be replaced. Because Richard, despite being married twice, has no children at all and shows no urgency whatsoever about the project of getting himself an heir, which we might think, again, we've seen the story of Henry VIII and so on, we might think that all kings were desperate for a son and heir. Richard had no children with his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, and it's not clear to what extent he, at least, was actively trying to. And after she died in 1394, when he remarried in 1396, he chose to marry the eldest daughter of the King of France. By this stage, he's agreed a truce and a treaty with the King of France. The eldest daughter of the King of France is 6 at the point when they get married. It's absolutely clear that they're not going to have children for a very long time. And while some people in England are saying, Sire, do you think you ought to think about this? He says, no, 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 it's fine. I'll bring her up in English ways. And, you know, he, I think, saw the possibility of having someone as close to his throne, even as an heir of his own body, as potentially a threat. I think he wanted to live in an eternal present in which he was the center of the known universe, at least from his own perspective.
Dear, oh dear.
Mm.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions since Christmas is coming. Now back to the show. I just wanted to go back a bit because his one great triumph, I suppose, is within 2 or 3 years of his coronation, or 4 years of his coronation, the Peasants' Revolt.
Yes, the Peasants' Revolt is a fascinating moment. So 1381, he's been king for 4 years, as you say. He's now 14. And that summer, the biggest popular rebellion that England has seen up to that point erupts across the southeast. And Richard famously responds with, I think it's right to say, great bravery, in that he is being called for by the rebels. They are calling for their king, who at 14, the rebels are blaming the great lords who run his government. They hate John of Gaunt. They burn down John of Gaunt's great, gorgeous palace of the Savoy on the road that goes from the city to Westminster. They burn it to ashes and so on. But they're calling for their king, young Richard, to do justice to them, to listen to their grievances. And Richard goes out to meet them once at Mile End to the east of the city, and once at Smithfield to the north, which is when Wat Tyler gets killed. And he does show great bravery and great poise. But I think what we have to remember when we're looking in detail at what's happening during this revolt is that the rebels hate the men who've been running Richard's government. They think the government is failing. They think it's corrupt. They think it's oppressing the people. The one person they think can save them, the one person they think is not blemished with the failings of this government, the one person they think that God has sent to rule England, is Richard. And Richard agrees with them. So while he is very brave to go out and do this, he rides out knowing that the rebels want to take and punish the traitors around him, as they say, which he knows is these great nobles who he also thinks have been getting in his way as king and have been stopping him ruling as he should. And he and the rebels both agree that he should be in charge. That when the rebels are advancing on London, one of the chroniclers says that they have a password on the roads. They say, anyone they stop, they say, "With whom hold you?" And the correct answer is, "With King Richard and the true commons." And if you don't know that answer, or you don't get it right, or you refuse to say it, you're going to get killed. So I don't think Richard has any very great interest in whether his people are suffering or oppressed, but he very much likes the message that he's the king, God's given him the authority to rule, and he ought to be allowed to get on with it.
Yes. I mean, it's almost comical now, but almost. It is a tragedy. Now, I'm so interested reading about how Henry, after overthrowing Richard, because of course we've been speaking almost entirely about Richard, Henry is sort of racked. It's not really guilt, is it? Or is it haunted by a kind of knowledge that he's done something that's wrong, even if it's for the right reasons?
I think that's it. I mean, of course, the justification for what he did in 1399, as we were saying earlier, is the belief that this is God's will. that Richard has forfeited his right to rule his people, and that it is God's will for Henry to take over. And Henry, of course, is then anointed, he's crowned. And he does hold on to the throne until his death. The problem being that his grip is pretty white knuckled for quite a lot of the time. He has to face so many challenges, both from outside the kingdom. The French are not happy that he's overthrown the king to whom they've just married their little princess and with whom they've made a peace treaty, a truce. The Scots are taking every opportunity to pour over the northern border and rampage around, as they always do whenever the opportunity arises. Owen Glendower decides that this is the moment to stake his claim to be Prince of an independent Wales. So there is a very, very difficult guerrilla war going on in the mountains and the towns of Wales for a lot of Henry's reign. But it's not only that, it's the fact that he is a usurper. He's the only possible candidate to take over from Richard in 1399, but his right to do so is not watertight. He can't say, I am definitively the legitimate heir to the throne, in the way that Edward III, a young boy when his father was overthrown, was then able to say, well, my father is dead, I'm the rightful king. Henry is Richard's first cousin, but there are other possible claimants on the complicated family tree. And so anyone who decides actually that they're not that happy with how he's ruling, or they think they might be better rewarded under a different regime, or that things were better in the old days because the glorious new world is not as glorious as they thought it was going to be, they've got an immediate cause to reach for. They can say, well, you're not the rightful king anyway. We're either going to revolt in the name of King Richard in case he's still alive somewhere, or we're going to support another claimant. And Henry is firefighting on every front for years at the beginning of his reign. And just when things are beginning to calm down, admittedly just after a rebellion in which he's ended up deciding he has to execute an archbishop for getting involved in this revolt, the Archbishop of York, his health collapses. And of course, the immediate explanatory framework, if a king's health collapses and if there are questions about his right to rule, is, well, you've angered God. And that is, I think, a thought that haunts Henry. Everything he's done and he's had to do is very present in his mind. And it's a very, very moving document, I think, when he writes his will at a moment when he's really unwell in January 1409. And it's a very unusual document as king's wills go in the Middle Ages. Most king's wills in this period, all the others, are written in either French or Latin, and they're written using the royal we, and they're very formal documents rather than intensely personal ones. But Henry's is written in English, and it's written using I, not the royal we. And it begins with this apparently anguished and heartfelt statement that I, Henry, I'm a sinful wretch. I have misspent my life, and I can only hope for redemption through God's mercy, into whose hands I commend my spirit. I'm paraphrasing, but it's a document that's well worth reading. It's an intensely personal document, and I think. And it doesn't. Whereas Richard, for example, Richard already built his own tomb when his first wife died. He designed this spectacular golden tomb in Westminster Abbey. He'd written his own epitaph to be put round it. When he finally wrote his will, when he went off to Ireland in 1399, he added more details about what he wanted to be dressed in for his funeral: white velvet or satin. He wanted a ring on his finger. It was theatrical for Richard. Richard didn't have any intention of dying then, and so it's all, and Richard's is all about controlling the future after whatever terrible day he eventually is overcome by fate, as his epitaph puts it. Whereas Henry, it's about the fate of his soul, it's about the sins he's committed, and it's about making sure that the men who've served him devotedly and loyally, including the domestic servants who are by now attending him night and day because he's so ill, ensuring that they are properly rewarded for their service and for the debt he feels he owes them. And he doesn't plan his funeral. He just says, my executors, my eldest son, I trust him, I commend the arrangements for everything to him and to my Archbishop of Canterbury. And his tomb is eventually commissioned by his widow in Canterbury Cathedral, and I think the alabaster portrait of him on his tomb is a very moving one. It's a face in which you can see a lot of the strain that he'd been carrying for the just over 13 years of his reign, and he was only 45 when he died. He was not an old man. He'd been a sort of golden boy, a golden young man, a chivalric hero, and I think he was aged before his time by the strain of what he had done and what it cost to keep going, not knowing whether God really had vindicated the choices he'd made.
But it's extraordinary to me because, like you've just been saying, the trouble with the French, okay, that's not new. Everyone's had that. And the Scots and the Welsh, actually, Edward the First, of course, and Henry the Third. And whilst he was, of course, a usurper, he had quite a strong claim. I was thinking about this vis-a-vis Henry the First and King Stephen, because you could make an argument that he had a stronger claim than Stephen.
Absolutely,
And Henry the First had written in his will that Matilda should take over.
he'd got his nobles to swear allegiance to her as his heir, etc. But I think there are a lot of differences between that situation, as you say, in the early 12th century and what's happening by the late 14th. In the early 12th century, we have to remember that it's not long since the conquest, really. And that shift from, well, an Anglo-Saxon set of rules of inheritance that don't necessarily put all the emphasis on male primogeniture. The Anglo-Saxon system is you have the athelings, the people who have a claim to rule, and you choose whichever is the best candidate from among them, which usually means they beat each other up until the strongest is left, whatever. But it's not at all clear how inheritance is going to work in this new Anglo-Norman world. William the Conqueror leaves Normandy to his eldest son, Robert, and England to his second son, Rufus. Rufus then fights Robert and sticks him in prison and takes both. Then when Rufus dies slightly mysteriously in the New Forest with Henry right there, Henry goes to get himself crowned. And what we have to remember at that point in the Anglo-Norman realm, that is England, getting yourself crowned is how a king is made. So whoever, it becomes a sort of race for the coronation chair. And what happens in 1135 when Henry dies, well, two things. One is he's only got a woman, his daughter Matilda, left to succeed him. Can a woman rule? Not clear. Henry wants his legitimate daughter to succeed him, and he's made everyone swear that she will. But in practice, does anyone really, can women do this? Plus, she's pregnant at the key moment and she's not in England and she can't get there quickly enough. Whereas Stephen, who's Count of Boulogne, just races for Winchester, gets himself crowned. And at that point, he's been anointed by God. Fast forward to the 14th century, and things have settled down an awful lot. It has become clear by precedent that a king's eldest son should become, the King of England's eldest son should become king after him. There has been an unbroken line of kings since then. I mean, Richard is very keen on the idea of that unbroken line of kings. He commissions a set of 13 statues to go in Westminster Hall, going all the way from the Confessor, who he believes has designated the conqueror to be his successor, and then an unbroken line of kings. So that inheritance is his. And it's much harder to break that precedent. It's clear by now that the king is dead, long live the king works, even if there's a little pause before your coronation. So those gaps, those possibilities of realpolitik overriding right has been damped down an awful lot. So it's a big thing, and it's less that Henry isn't the obvious candidate in 1399. He is the obvious candidate in 1399, and he succeeds, unopposed. The first rebellion comes 3 months after his coronation. So at his coronation, all the nobles, all the surviving nobles are there. It's more that anyone who gets disgruntled for whatever reason, and the Percys are the Percy, great family of the North, are a great example of this. They have supported Henry in 1399. They've been his right-hand men. They've had huge power handed over to them. But by 1403, Hotspur is extremely angry about how he's been treated. He's had power given to him and then taken away. He's been made to pay for the war in Wales more or less himself because Henry's also got no money. And he decides that he's made a king once, he'll do it again, and he'll do better under the next regime. He doesn't manage it, but it's a close run thing. The Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, a pitched battle on English soil between two very evenly matched English armies in which Henry's oldest son, Prince Henry, nearly dies. And so again, that's God's vindication that King Henry wins the battle. Prince Henry survives this terrible injury. He gets an arrow embedded 6 inches deep in his face. So Henry's getting reassurance, but it's not the last rebellion. And every further rebellion there is, the question is raised again.
I'm glad you mentioned Prince Henry becomes Henry V. Dan Jones has been on recently because, of course, he's written a book on Henry V. And Henry and Richard actually have a relationship. Well, he takes Henry with him. It doesn't sound like Richard really has a relationship with anyone apart from himself.
No, I mean, possibly, this is a whole other story, but his favourite in the early years of the reign, Robert de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, is the one man you can look at, really, throughout his life, whose interests mattered to Richard clearly as much or even more than his own. This was a great sort of passion in his life, not necessarily a physical passion, but the jury's out on that one. I think not, but that was a deeply emotional relationship. But yes, you're absolutely right. When Richard went off to Ireland in 1399, he took young Henry Bolingbroke's son, with him, whether as a hostage or whether he might have had his eye on him as someone he could detach from his father. And Richard has not said at that point that he will never give the Duchy of Lancaster back. He's sort of dangling it high in the air as a carrot that maybe one day I'll think about it. So yes, so Henry Bolingbroke has to go off into exile in Paris, knowing that his eldest son and heir is in Richard's custody. So young Henry, and I think this is a very interesting thing, while Richard is having no children at all, Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV, has got married very young, seems to have had a very happy marriage very young, and had a huge family very young. And he and his wife Mary, their first 4 children are all boys, and then they have 2 girls. Then poor Mary dies. So he's got this big brood of heirs, but the experience of young Prince Henry as he becomes is so very different from Henry Bolingbroke. Henry Bolingbroke is the fated heir to the Duchy of Lancaster, which is the richest noble inheritance in England and becomes one of the richest noble inheritances in Europe. So whatever Henry has learned, and he's the future King Henry, do wish they had different names. It makes it very, very difficult to write about and to talk about. But the future King Henry, he's learned so many things. He's learned to be a leader of men. He's very charismatic. People love him. He makes friends very easily. He's a great jouster. He's a great fighter. He's a very cultured man. He loves books. He loves music. He's a fascinating and very appealing man in lots of ways. But it's been a golden youth. And the one thing he absolutely has not learned to do is count pennies, economize, work out what it is to keep an eye on an administration. There's always been so much money sloshing around in the Duchy of Lancaster for his purposes. He goes on these great journeys across Europe, and Gaunt is just sending money via the Italian bankers to make sure he's got enough for the next leg of his journey. Young Prince Henry, as he becomes, he's had a very tough life. Privileged in many ways, but his whole life has been marked by political crisis. He's been in this very difficult situation off in Ireland with Richard, then comes back more or less straight into his father's coronation, and is then sent off because he's the new Prince of Wales, and the rebellion in Wales erupts in 1400. He's sent off with Hotspur as his mentor into Wales to try and put down this rebellion. And the letters he writes back to his father saying, right, well, we've just burned Glendower's house, but please, can I have some money? And there's no money to be had. So instead of the jousting, the courtliness, the travels, the golden youth, this is a hard, hard apprenticeship. It's all about fighting. It's all about making sure that the men who work for you are doing their job properly and that not a single penny is going astray. And that's exactly what you can see when Henry V becomes king. He is one of the greatest kings England ever had. And that's partly he gets the chance to be that because his father has clung on and handed the crown over to him, so that even though Henry IV was a usurper, not necessarily the rightful heir to the throne, Henry V is the rightful heir of the previous king. So he's operating from the beginning in a more straightforward landscape of legitimacy, if you like. But he's also had such a hard apprenticeship, and he's learned his lesson so well as such an able man that he knows exactly what he has to do to make this whole machine work. Whereas his father, who I think is a more human figure, or at least it's possible to see him in three dimensions as a more human figure, because I think Henry V, the mask of rule he wears so impressively that it's quite hard to see the man behind, if there's any distinction between the mask and the man. I think you can see Henry IV more clearly, and to me, there's a great appeal there of a human being struggling with the responsibilities and the self-doubt that Henry does. But it's Henry V who makes medieval kingship work in an extraordinary way.
Yeah, absolutely. But I completely see what you see. It's a lot easier for us to identify, I suppose, with a self-doubting person like Henry IV. But we're nearly out of time. So I suppose slightly in that vein, there is mention, I think it might have been in the PR leaflet that I received, mention masculinity in crisis. And I think we've just talked about men pretty much non-stop, Helen, and I know that what you've just illustrated in this discussion is I guess masculinity in crisis. How much of it was that kind of sense of maleness? I mean, there's not many. The influence of women on these two men is that part of a problem in that it's lacking?
One of the things I wanted to do in the book was, I mean, there are a lot of women in this story, but they're sort of round the edges, and I've tried always to. I'm thinking about how I could perhaps do something more with this, because so many of their stories are absolutely fascinating. I've tried to make them human and show what they too were grappling with. But really, one of the issues at the heart of this story is the ongoing war. As you say, everyone has problems with France, but of course, we know we call it the 100 Years' War. They didn't know they were fighting the 100 Years' War. They didn't know, we're about halfway through, lads, we'll, just have a breather. They were struggling with a war that had been started in 1340 by Edward III in this game-changing way of the King of England claiming the throne of France. And that means it's very difficult to stop, because it's very difficult to find terms on which you can actually find a permanent settlement. And so this whole period that my book is covering is a period where the war is going badly for England. There is a real existential threat there, because one of the reasons the war had been going so well for England before that point is all the fighting had been happening in France. So you get all of if you're winning victories in France, then the scorched earth is all on the other side of the channel and you're just bringing the booty home. The risk is the polarity is going to be reversed and the scorched earth might now be in England. But also that you then have a king who doesn't want to do that bit of kingship. Now, we might sympathize. I wouldn't want to get my sword and ride off in the front line. It's a frightening and horrible thing to contemplate, but it's part of the job of being king. If you look at the two sides of a king's seal in the Middle Ages, on one side, he's on his war horse in armor with his sword unsheathed to defend his kingdom against attack. And often attack is the best form of defense. If you're fighting in France, they're not fighting in England. On the other side is the king sitting on his throne in majesty with his orb and scepter and crown as a judge and a lawgiver. Richard liked that model much better, albeit that he didn't think he should have to obey the law that he was imposing on everyone else. Richard didn't want to fight. But when you're in the middle of a war, just saying don't want to, which is more or less what Richard was saying for a long time, doesn't really work. And so what it meant in this political system that is geared up to needing a leader who is a military leader as well as a political one, then to find themselves with a king whose ideal state of kingship would be to sit silently and gloriously and magnificently on his throne with everyone kneeling before him. That is what Richard is aiming for. How does that work when there's a war going on? And that's one of the reasons that I'm saying is Henry V is one of the greatest medieval kings, because he fights a great and terrible war, and then dies in the middle of it, of course. But so what it is to be a king when a king has to be male, they believe, and one of the reasons he has to be male is that he has to be able to lead soldiers in battle. But then you have a king who is refusing to do that, but is also even mainly refusing to engage with, well, if I don't want to fight, I better make peace. Richard doesn't really want to deal with the nitty-gritty of that either. So the questions that then get asked about what makes a king are at the heart of what makes a king, and what qualities of being a man make a good king are at the heart of this story.
Absolutely, and I guess we come back to Shakespeare again, and at the heart of that too.
In that extraordinary play, I mean, yes, I go back, I see something new every time. Every time I go back to Richard II, and you're absolutely right. It's all about what is the relationship between being a king and being a man, and what happens when you move between the two in either direction. Yeah.
Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Helen. Thank you so much. This is a fantastic book. So, listeners, links are in the show notes. But Helen, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. From us all at Aspects of History, we hope you had a wonderful Christmas and wish you a Happy New Year.